are making a Star Wars diorama today, with a bunch of OG characters and a few newer ones. Let's start with an unboxing. That's always good for a few minutes of low-effort content, or a few seconds of high-effort content. Let's get started with the build. Step 1 is reposing the figures, starting with Chewbacca. He's going to be kneeling behind a tactical display console. My knee! My knee! The joints that need to be posed are cut. It's much easier to cut if the part is bent over something so it's under tension. Otherwise, there's a lot of sticky sawing to get through it. The cut ends of the joints are drilled, wires glued in, the two are rejoined, and then Chewie gets posed. After posing, the joints get packed with epoxy putty to fill in the gap and lock everything in place. Used a toothpick to do some carving and shaping. And with that, the first figure was finished, 6 more to go. Leia is next. She's crouching down to take cover behind the display. She needs some of her vest carved away to clear her thighs. Then we cut her off at the knees and chop some angles on the joints.
Oh, that's why it was so janky. Hey, Turn, why would you do that? The articulation they put on these models is just insane.
Her feet get cut off at the ankles and glued back on at the appropriate angle. Luke gets the same treatment. Chop, drill, wire, glue, and pose. And we can't forget his big toe.
And now we need to pose Han Solo. I think that's about perfect.
Now we'll do the Sith apprentice. She doesn't need her desert robes because she's going to have a full-fledged Sith apprentice robe. As I started posing her, I found out she's more articulated than the other figures. A lot more articulated.
Why? Why would they put the joints on there like this?
Eventually, I got over the spectacle of her bizarre anatomy and came up with a pose that would work for a Sith apprentice. She got glued into position, but fortunately didn't need any epoxy in her joints. Time to make the lightsaber and blaster shot. We start with a 12-volt LED bulb, take it apart, and scavenge the parts we need: the LED filament and driver board. The filaments are welded to the lead frame, so they need to be cut off. These filaments are nice because they're rigid, and they'll work good for shooting out of a gun or being a lightsaber. We use magnet wire for the connections. It's nice because it's small diameter and has very thin insulation, but the insulation needs to be sanded off. The leads get soldered onto the LED strip. LEDs from bulbs are handy, but one thing to keep in mind is even though it's got a 12-volt supply, the LED runs at like 60 to 70 volts, so you should be careful. After it's soldered, we give it a test. And it works. We snip the blade off the lightsaber, hollow out the end of the handle, and glue the filament on. The lightsaber gets glued into Luke's hand, and rather than trying to drill perfectly intersecting holes through the figure, I decided to route the wires down to his rear foot along his body, counting on the black color of his clothes to help hide them. We repeated the process for Han's blaster shot. Next is the Evil Empress, crafted from the finest Final Faction figures Dollar Tree has to offer. She needs her arms and hands reposed to shoot Force Lightning, so she gets the same cut, drill, wire, glue, and pose as everyone else. While Final Faction makes a fine figure, that is not the head of a Sith Lord, so off it comes. Now we need to figure out who the most evil Sith Lord is, so let's ask Google. Google says it's Darth Sidious, so let's see if we can find some pictures. That's one evil-looking Sith Lord. But he's dead, unless somehow he returns. But that's not going to happen. So let's find another Sith Lord, one who is more evil than Darth Sidious. That looks pretty evil. Let's grab a few pictures and see if we can sculpt up a new evil Empress in Blender. And here's the result of my first sculpted human head. It looks okay, but it needs to be twisted up a little bit from the dark side of the Force. The model gets exported as an STL, sliced up, 3D printed, and then glued onto our figure. Now she needs a fitting outfit. We'll give her the classic Evil Empress robes. I made an armature to help form the tissue paper, which will form them. Now, a little tissue paper, a lot of cutting, and a lot of glue gives us the robes of the Sith Lord. The tissue paper gets sealed and firmed up with a coating of Mod Podge. The same materials and technique give the Sith apprentice her robes. Here's the crew all modified and posed. And here they are with the Zenithal Prime. Painting time. Started putting filters over the Zenithal Prime. This is how Han turned out. I don't like it. The clothing is okay, but I don't like the faces. I think this method works better at smaller scales, so I'm going to paint the faces in the traditional way. Here they are painted. Not perfect, but better than they were turning out with the filters. The Sith Lord's green-gray skin turned out a little more green than gray, but that's okay, it'll contrast with her black robes. Glowing red eyes finish her off. Here's the crew finished and painted, laid out so I can start the diorama base. We cut a piece of precision hobby styrene to form the floor, and it will get glued to a piece of XPS foam that forms the base. Next, we scribe panel lines into that piece of styrene. Han and Luke used a maintenance tunnel to sneak up behind the bad guys, so we're cutting an access hatch they can pop out of.
Access hatch popped.
Another piece of precision hobby styrene gets scribed and a hole cut in it for a giant display forming the back wall. We use a piece of XPS foam to support the back wall and mark out a hole for the giant display. The back wall needs more interest, so I designed a 3D printed light panel. Now we'll mark it out so we can cut a hole and light it from the back. We cut the hole in the back wall. And in the floor. Next is the hole for the light panel. Now we put some spray adhesive on the back panel, put a piece of plain white paper on as a diffuser behind the light panel, and a printed out picture of a planet for the display. The last step is gluing the back wall to the XPS foam. A whole bunch of hot glue, and we get the back wall stuck to the base. The tactical display console was designed up in Blender, then 3D printed on a filament printer. Next, we take a Star Destroyer from the internet and make it into a hologram for the tactical display in Blender, then 3D print it in clear resin. The console is 3D printed in one piece. This resulted in a rough finish on the upper part, so it gets a lot of filler and sanding. If I did this over, I would print the display in two parts. Next, the lights on the side get drilled in a random fashion. A violet LED gets glued in to light up the hologram. The hope was it would make the resin fluoresce, but it wasn't the right wavelength, so it just gets lit up in a bluish color instead of glowing green. Some plain white paper gets glued behind the panel as a diffuser. This was accomplished with a lot of fingers stuck to the paper and the console and swearing. Did I mention printing this in two pieces? We solder together 3 red LEDs and bend the leads to position them so the light spreads out. A big glob of hot glue holds them in place. The hologram gets wedged into the top of the display, and a few drops of super glue hold it in place. After drilling a hole, copious amounts of super glue hold the console in place. The figures get positioned, marked, and glued to the diorama. Now the evil Empress gets the lightsaber hole drilled through her torso. The lightsaber gets threaded through the Empress, a hole drilled in the right spot in the floor, and a dab of glue holds Luke in place. One more hole, and Han gets glued in place. The final piece is gluing the access panel in place, and the diorama's done.
Next time I'm just going to open the box. Oh, look, accessories. And no fire.